I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, political chaos, which seems to be running rampant everywhere, including the State of Israel. As I'm sure most of you know, this past week, while I was on vacation with my new grandson in Florida, Benny Gantz, leader of the Blue and White, was also unable to form a coalition of 61 or more seats. He failed in trying to create a new coalition government. And this past week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was finally formally indicted by Israel's Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So in one fell swoop, the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, and contrary to what many in the American media have said, Benjamin Netanyahu is, at the moment, the acting Prime Minister of Israel, and Israeli law says that while a sitting Prime Minister may be indicted and may be brought to trial, the Prime Minister does not have to step down unless he is convicted. And Attorney General Mandelblit has made it clear that Benjamin Netanyahu does not have to step down, nor is he required to take a leave of absence because of the 3 indictments. By the way, it's interesting the way Israeli law works. If Bibi is the prime minister at the time of a trial, that trial will take place in Jerusalem, which is on the right side of the political spectrum. If Bibi were not prime minister at the time of his trial, the trial would be held in Tel Aviv, which of course is a left-leaning community. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the best outcome he can hope for is that the trial will take place in Jerusalem, and he'll either be acquitted or be given a slap on the wrist, and then his political career can continue. The worst outcome for Bibi would be a trial in Tel Aviv, where he could be convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In the meantime, unless someone walks into President Reuven Rivlin's office before December 11th, bringing him 61 or more Knesset member signatures to create a new coalition government, Israel will be faced with a 3rd round of elections in 1 year. Now on JBS, we've been saying that the numbers seem to show that the results of this September's election, the 2nd round of elections, could not yield a coalition government of 61 or more seats, and that a 3rd round of elections was inevitable. To remind you of the numbers, here they are. Notice on the left, we have Blue and White's possible coalition. If Blue and White had the Democratic camp added, if Labor added, if Yamina was added, and even if Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, joined the coalition, Gantz would only have 59 seats, and basically that's what happened. On the right, by the way, you see that Likud only had 55 seats if it was joined by Shas and United Torah Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox parties, and if Yamina went on the right, you'd still have only 55 seats. If we look at the next slide, here we see what would happen if Yisrael Beitenu, if Avigdor Lieberman's party moved from the left to the right, bringing 9 seats. If Yamina also joined, lo and behold, that would have given Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud a coalition government of 64 seats, but Yisrael Beitenu refused to join. Without the Arab parties, Blue and White could not reach 61 seats. And at this point in time, when the Arab members of the Knesset rail against the legitimacy of a Jewish Israel, it's simply unreasonable to assume any major Israeli party could include the joint Arab list in a coalition government. On the other hand, the only way Likud could have put together this coalition government is if Avigdor Lieberman brought his Israel Beitenu party into the right wing, and it was included with the Orthodox parties. But Lieberman has been adamant that he will not empower the Orthodox parties, which is why Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud failed at their crack at creating a governing coalition. And similarly, members of Blue and White, especially Yair Lapid, also said there would be no left-leaning coalition that would include the Orthodox parties. And so here we are, with a sitting Israeli Prime Minister, Israel's longest-serving Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, under indictment while still holding office, and the Israeli people facing a third national election. Well, for some analysis of the chaos Israel finds itself in, we turn now, as we so often do, to one of the leading journalists in the Jewish world today, the Washington bureau chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Ron Kampeas. Ron, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me.
Ron, first of all, is there anything you want to add to the political picture in Israel today?
No, I think you pretty much had it right. The only wrinkle I think that you didn't mention is that Gideon Sa'ar, a rival of Netanyahu within the Likud, wants to accelerate primaries so he can challenge Netanyahu ahead of that December the 11th deadline. I mean, that would have, where are we? We're November the 25th today. That they'd have to get that underway and done very fast. So voters would have a clearer picture if Netanyahu were out of the Likud, obviously, or even if he were in the Likud, they would have a clearer picture of what would be going on before elections take place in March.
I want you to amplify that because it is a very important point for our audience to understand in terms of the current dynamic of Israeli politics. One of the problems is that now we have the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, under indictment. For many Israelis, it's simply unacceptable to have a Prime Minister who's under indictment. What you're saying is Likud could ironically do better if there were internal Likud elections and Benjamin Netanyahu was not number one any longer. And you mentioned Gideon Sa'ar. He seems to be the major candidate. Are there any other, by the way, people inside Likud who might unseat Benjamin Netanyahu for the number one slot in Likud? And then if Likud was part of a coalition government, Benjamin Netanyahu would not be the prime minister, but whoever was in the number one slot would. That's the scenario you're painting. And the two questions, number one, is there anybody else other than Gideon Sa'ar? And number two, what's the likelihood of that happening as far as you're concerned?
I think I've heard that Gilad Erdan might pose, although he hasn't declared. Gideon Sa'ar is the one who's declared. But if it happens, if there are primaries, I think it'll open up. There'll be a clamoring. But I think that also the likeliness that it occurs. I think that inevitably that there are cracks showing. It's like Netanyahu has managed to command the loyalty of the party for quite a while now. But I think Israelis are getting exhausted. You're getting people saying, enough. Let's just get the fact that Gideon Sa'ar had the guts to come out and say it shows that Netanyahu perhaps doesn't have the iron grip on the party that he says he has. So, the chances of this happening before December the 11th, which would allow Blue and White and Likud to form a coalition outright, probably are slim simply because of the time factor. The chances of it happening before the March elections, I think, are fairly good of a Likud primary.
Okay. So basically, you're agreeing the most likely outcome at the moment is a third round of elections this coming March.
Yeah, I think that's right. As somebody who sits here in the United States and who lived in Israel and who, like you, obsessively watches how things are going there. Obviously, if you're living there, you have a better perspective. But
Okay.
Right, yes.
Do you have any sense? Again, you are in Washington, but do you have any sense right now from the people you talk to? How do the Israeli people feel about the indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I mean, you're getting, the Likud base again feels that he's hard done by. He really has them, he has a very loyal following. I think Israelis generally, though, are they expect their leaders to take responsibility and face the music when something like this happens. I mean, even though among people who think that he's been hard done by, that that perhaps that the system really is stepped up against him, as he says. Well, just don't let this distract the country. You need to step down, to let another right-wing or conservative leader take the reins, and you've done a great job, but you're not, nobody's irreplaceable.
Okay. Ron, can you outline the three charges Attorney General Mandelblit has indicted Netanyahu for?
I forget which one goes with which, but there is one is accepting, I think two of them at least I can. One of them is the acceptance of gifts from donors to his campaigns, from influential, wealthy people, particularly Arnon Milchan, the Hollywood producer and arms dealer who lives both here in the United States and in Israel. And another one is the solicitation of, I guess it would be solicitation of bribery, the whole thing where he tried to get favorable coverage in Yediot Ahronot if he undercut Yediot Ahronot's rival, Yisrael Hayom, which was a newspaper. Sorry, Yediot Ahronot is a newspaper, and if he said he would undercut Yisrael Hayom, which is a rival newspaper which has traditionally backed Bibi. So those two are the ones I can remember off the top of my head. What was the third one? Do you have your finger on that one?
At the moment, I'm sitting here and I can't remember. They basically were two bribes. One had to do with taking champagne and cigars and doing that
for the likes of Arnon Milchan. Right.
This had to do with Bezek, correct?
Oh, that's right. There was the third charge has to do with the ownership of Bezek, which is one of the communications giants in Israel,
right.
and behind the scenes dealings with that.
Yes, Netanyahu's argument is that much of this is normal political give and take, and that he did nothing that was contrary to Israeli law. And we're going to see now it looks to me like there definitely will be a trial. But those are the three charges against him. And, it's not what he received that is so upsetting, champagne and cigars.
Cigars.
Right. But the question is, what did he try to do, and what policy in Israel did he try to change, even for something as innocent or as minor as champagne and cigars? It's interesting, Ron, because here in America, the political intrigue seems to be much more significant than champagne and cigars. But he did try to, he is charged with trying to basically lobby for Bezek. And then he also seemed to be saying, I will, trade good coverage in one Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, if he would agree to get Israel Hayom, which is Sheldon Adelson's newspaper, to cut back its circulation. Netanyahu was not impressed by that charge. It'll be interesting to see how he is handled. What are the chances that he would be convicted if the trial were held in Jerusalem, which is where he will be tried if he is still sitting prime minister?
I think it's. I don't think that there's no trial by jury in Israel. It's all by judges, and I don't think that there's much of a difference in the composition of the courts depending on whether you're in the Tel Aviv district or the Jerusalem district. I think that he faces the same risk wherever he's tried. I think that, like you say, I mean, particularly in this age, the charges are simply not as compelling. You have to think about the charges to make them compelling. So I don't know to what degree the Israeli judiciary, Israeli judges are sensitive to public opinion. In my memory, not that much. They're not that sensitive to public opinion. Okay. But certainly, I think that in the public sphere, Netanyahu is making a strong case that these aren't as serious as everybody's depicting them. On the other hand, 10 years ago, another prime minister facing similar charges went to jail, Ehud Olmert.
Yes, but do you remember why?
Ahead.
Do you remember what he was charged with?
Yeah, he was charged with accepting gifts, very similar in the sense that he was charged with accepting gifts from overseas donors, which he was forbidden to do as an Israeli prime minister. That was that's one case in which it was very similar. And as you say, the other charges that Netanyahu faces, on the face of it, his argument is correct. Politicians negotiate for good coverage all the time.
Right.
The problem is that Netanyahu wasn't offering Arnon Moses, the publisher of Yediot Achronot, access or something. He wasn't saying, look, I'll return your reporters' calls, and I'll, if you write nice things about me, I'll make sure that you get scoops. He was offering to affect another business, a competitive business, because that's the problem there.
Exactly right.
And I think that the bigger picture with that, for a lot of Israelis, is simply that Netanyahu has that kind of business relationship with Israel Hayom. It's great that they give him good coverage, but there's also seems to be it seems untoward that he has such influence over a newspaper to the degree that Sarah Netanyahu was calling up and insisting on tweaks in coverage. Some of the most damaging testimony, I think, in that, or not testimony because the trial hasn't come yet, but some of the most damaging affidavits in that come from the Adelstons themselves, who said that they stopped taking Sarah Netanyahu's calls because they felt so besieged by her.
Yes, although Adelston says Netanyahu never called him and never made any kind of request. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. It seemed to me that when Ehud Olmert was convicted, his crimes were of a greater magnitude than Netanyahu's. At the same time, politics are a hard, ugly, dirty game. And right now, many Israelis feel that he's simply been there too long, and he doesn't have the same kind of national sympathy that he once might have had. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what the polling says, but anecdotally, just talking to Israelis and, seeing what they say and talking to people who are of influence there, I think that he no longer has the cachet that he once had. I mean, like I said, I'm hearing voices from people who traditionally supported him saying, "Step down, face the charges. You'll probably be acquitted. You've done a great service to this country, but you're standing in the way of it functioning normally."
Yes.
And so I think there's that as well.
The one thing I will say is we recently televised a conversation between Danny Gordis and Thomas Friedman. And one of the things that Danny Gordis said was, many, many Israelis feel exactly as you've said about Netanyahu. And yet their biggest concern is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as it is for American Jewry. It's Iran. And that Israelis still see Bibi Netanyahu as the strongest protector of the state of Israel vis-a-vis Iran, and that therefore, and now I'm quoting Danny Gordis, Israelis hold their nose and vote for Netanyahu. And that also seems to be how the last number of elections have gone, and Bibi continues to be, again, we talk about this all the time, he's now the longest governing Israeli prime minister in Israel's history. But Ron, there seems to be some truth to that.
I think so. I mean, and it's why I think that during not the last election, but the one before that, the one that was in March or in April, in the spring, is that Netanyahu hit out at Benny Gantz as vulnerable on Iran. He's talking about how Iran managed to somehow hack into Benny Gantz's phone, although that's not necessarily Benny Gantz's fault, obviously. But yeah, I think that Netanyahu understands that one of his assets is the strength that he projects towards Iran, and not just in terms of being a tough guy, but in building a sort of a de facto coalition with Sunni Arab states. That's considered to be that's also seen as a big plus on his side.
Yes. bottom line now, it seems to me that the stalemate we've seen in election 1 and election 2 can only be broken if either Netanyahu is removed in one way or the other. Either he steps down or he loses his #1 slot in the Likud party itself. Or something dramatic happens that make people again say, we'll hold our nose and do it again and vote for Netanyahu. But otherwise, we're just going to see election after election after election because the numbers haven't seemed to change, Ron.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's we're not even talking about the obstruction being the voting population. The obstruction is the leaders of two parties, Israel Beiteinu, Avigdor Lieberman,
yes,
and the Blue and White Party, Yair Lapid particularly, but also the other leaders, Moshe Yaalon and Benny Gantz, and Gabi Ashkenazi, who do not want to work with the Netanyahu government. They'll work with the Likud. They don't want to work with Netanyahu
yes.
government.
And they don't want
they have the backing, and their followers support that.
Absolutely. But they also don't want to work with the ultra-Orthodox. And that keeps them also from getting this coalition government. All right. Look, while I have you, Ron, you're based in Washington. You see the American political scene up close. What's been the Jewish community's reaction to Michael Bloomberg's throwing his hat into the race to become the Democratic candidate for president?
I think that the Jewish reaction is I think it's a little too soon to assess what the Jewish reaction is so much, but I would imagine that it's the same as the broader reaction. Michael Bloomberg is coming in because the most charismatic, I wouldn't say charismatic, the most compelling candidates in the Democratic primaries so far are way to the left of the party. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, of course. And there doesn't seem to be yet, although Pete Buttigieg is pulling ahead, there doesn't seem to be yet a moderate that can forcefully challenge him. And so that's where Michael Bloomberg sees a vacuum that he can fill. And and on the Jewish question also, Bloomberg is very solidly pro-Israel.
Yes.
He flew to Israel in 2014 during the Gaza war there to show his solidarity. I think that would put to bed a lot of pro-Israel Jewish concerns about the party, at least from the centrist and the centrist AIPAC aligned pro-Israel camp. If he came in.
Well, he won the Genesis Prize, did he not?
He won the Genesis Prize. Not only he won the first Genesis Prize in 2014, and not only that, he set the precedent where he took that $1 million and gave it to charity. So every subsequent winner has done the same thing.
Yes. He also is a very outspoken critic of the BDS movement, which he basically says is immoral and outrageous. It would be interesting for the President of the United States to be taking that public stand. So I think you're right when you talk about how the AIPAC Jew in America would react. By the way, he's a white billionaire and he's Jewish. And there are some who say, at the moment, that's not how the Democratic Party is going. Billionaire, white, and Jewish. And although Bernie Sanders is Jewish, Ron, many people don't take him seriously the way they take Michael Bloomberg seriously, even the extent to which he is or is not Jewish. But some say that America is simply not ready for a Jewish president. Do you have any instinct on that?
I actually just wrote about this, so I can talk about it quite fluently. I think that if you look at the Pew Religious Organization surveys, and they're comprehensive and good surveys, the Jews remain the most popular religious group in America. I think there's a lot of positive feelings out there about Jews and about Jewish candidates. I don't think it matters. I think that Joe Lieberman being effectively having won the popular vote as vice president in 2000 kind of buried that idea. On the other hand, what is true is that there are people out there who are trying to weaponize certain ideas about Jewish billionaires and control. Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, a Republican minority leader in the House, and the National Rifle Association have both in the past saying, don't let these people buy your party. And they've named George Soros, Michael Bloomberg, buy the country, George Soros, Michael Bloomberg, and Tom Steyer, whose father is Jewish. And there's like a sort of like intentionally, unintentionally, there's a kind of a wisp of a sense there that they're outsiders because, not just because they're billionaires, but because they're Jewish. And so like there's a fear that that kind of imagery would pop up. And so, and sure enough, the National Rifle Association, of course, Bloomberg has made his name as a very wealthy gun control advocate. The National Rifle Association, the first picture they posted on Twitter after the announcement was of a giant Michael Bloomberg grabbing the White House. So you're looking very sinister. And I'm not saying the NRA is intentionally anti-Semitic, but that's the kind of image that I think people are really worried about when somebody like Michael Bloomberg runs.
Well, it'll be a fascinating thing to watch, and you and I will talk about it here on JBS so that our viewers will get your sense of where it's going. Bernie Sanders is Jewish, and Bernie Sanders was criticizing Michael Bloomberg for being too rich. It's fascinating to watch. Anyway, I appreciate so much always you're giving us time, and I appreciate your insight so very much. I wish you all the best as we head toward the end of this calendar year, and you and I will speak often, but thank you always, Ron, for being here with us.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on your grandson, and you should enjoy him.
Thank you so very much. Ron Kampeas, Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And it's interesting times, you know that saying? Be careful if you're living in interesting times, political interesting times here in America and in Israel. Thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, Technical Director, Michael Paley, Transmission Manager, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. By the way, I had a wonderful time at Saul Zim's concert last night. It was last night, Sunday night, where some of the loveliest people were there. Fabulous concert. Mazal Tov to Saul Zim, and thank you for the honor you bestowed upon me, Saul. It was very, very much appreciated. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.